Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Grassroots Chronicles. I am your co-host, Carlos Mulathaler, a.k.a. Mr. Grassroots, and along with me is Caleb Stokes, a.k.a. Mr. Communication. And joining us, as always, our producer and the man behind the scenes, Jonathan Torres, with the Yard Sign Network.
Fellas, we are getting incredible response from part one of this series, so part two better be good. Let's go.
Let's do it. And this is part two of Sal Alinsky's Rules for Radicals and how he was instrumental in building communities for his causes. He is considered the first political community builder here in the United States. I also want to remind our audience that we do not endorse candidates or political parties. We are here strictly to inform and educate individuals on how they can change their community from a grassroots level. So let's kick it off. Caleb.
Thank you, Carlos, Mr. Grassroots. Yes, today we are diving into Saul Alinsky in the second part of this series. And just to sort of revisit a little bit from episode number one on Saul Alinsky. Like Carlos said, he's really recognized as the first community organizer in American history. He is left-leaning, to say the least. He was incredibly progressive. However, you do not have to agree with his politics in order to understand the rules he implemented and maybe try to employ some of those rules yourself in your own campaigns, whether you're running for public office or just an educational campaign. But Alinsky was very much contrarian. He considered himself a rebel, often said that if he saw a sign in the grass that said, "Keep off the grass," he would immediately go into the yard and start stomping all over the grass. He was such a contrarian that his book, Rules for Radicals, that we're going to talk about today, he dedicated that book to Lucifer. He's really well known in political circles. Hillary Clinton actually wrote her senior thesis on Saul Alinsky. They were pen pals for several years while she was writing the thesis and then after. Barack Obama has said that Saul Alinsky's tactics and his rules for radicals actually gave him a leg up when he was a community organizer in Chicago. And it should be known Saul Alinsky is also from Chicago. So a lot of those fun political battles in the city of Chicago between all of the dailies and their opponents, a lot of that comes from Saul Alinsky. And I'd like to say, I just used the word opponent. Alinsky writes often utilizing the word enemy. We do not have political enemies. We have political opponents, because even if they're our opponent on this one particular issue, they may wind up siding with us on another issue. So again, we do not have enemies. We only have opponents. So Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, it's a book that I highly recommend you reading. Many of those rules are employed by both the left and the right in current politics. Donald Trump, as we said last episode, utilizes several, if not all, of Alinsky's tactics. Last episode, we talked 1 through 7. Right now, we're going to begin with number 8. Again, you are listening to the Grassroots Chronicles on the Yard Sign Network. Rule number 8, keep the pressure on. Basically, what this means is if you give up, if you have a short-lived campaign, you're setting precedent of failure if you give up. Let's say that there's a referendum at city council that you really support and you really want to be passed. And you show up to a meeting 1 month, maybe another meeting the next month, and you find out it doesn't get passed. So you step back and say, okay, we'll wait for the next issue. That demonstrates to city council members that you're not taking this issue seriously, or you're not passionate enough about the issue in order to see it through and see the bill be passed. If that's the case, you're probably not going to have a lot of sway in the decision that a city council member might make. So again, if you're supporting or opposing any type of bill, make sure that you're showing up regularly. If this is that city council referendum or bill that could be passed in your city council, show up to every single meeting. Bring your friends. Bring folks and activists wearing T-shirts supporting your initiative. If you continually keep the pressure on, then eventually you're going to wind up swaying someone and how they vote. Carlos, you were on the ground in grassroots for a couple decades. What's an example of a time when you've seen a group of activists keep pressure on an elected official and actually find success in doing so?
There's been numerous throughout my career, you're correct. You cannot take your foot off the gas. You have to constantly be in front of the public official. You have to remind them who you are and why you're there. You have to continue to bring people into the fold. And in grassroots, also, to me, this particular rule of Saul Alinsky is I see it more in the race. The way for me, when you're in a race and campaigns, is just because you're 10 or 12 points up 2 weeks before, don't say, oh, well, we don't have to do any more phone banking. We don't have to go knock any doors. Or, you know what, hold off on that direct mail. Let's save some money. No, you have to make sure that every cartridge has been fired in your cylinder, in your revolver. Don't let anything stay, behind, because you never know when you take your foot off that gas, the other person has got, more momentum. Things are happening. So Sal Alinsky is correct. If you're going to either be in a grassroots battle or race or an issue, you have to constantly be on top of the situation until either you win or you lose. But you should, runners will identify with this. You run through the finish line, right? You don't, you see the tape and you don't go, oh, I've won. How many times have we seen people that, somebody from behind comes in and beats you in the last minute by a nose, literally. So that's where I take that particular rule for Saul Alinsky, and I've encouraged and I've used it in my many years out in the field, where it's like, you cannot let up. It's the night before, we got this wrapped up. No, we're knocking on doors. We're reminding people there's an election, or we're calling them that they haven't voted, or what the case may be, or the absentees need to be in. But you must run through the finish line, win, lose, or draw. At least you gave it all. You left it all. You left it all out there.
And to even take it a step further, let's say you wind up losing the election. Great. Don't take your foot off the pedal. Keep moving forward. Mm-hmm. Chances are in that election, you probably gained some legitimacy. People are now more aware of the issue that you're supporting. So even if you lose, keep the pressure on. Keep moving forward. That's Alinsky's rule number 8. Rule number 9 is one of my favorites. The threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. So let's set the scene a little bit and go to Chicago, O'Hare International Airport. It was created and opened in 1958, and it was such a huge deal. This was going to be an international hub of commerce, bringing folks from around the world into Chicago so people could invest in the Chicago economy. In 1958, O'Hare International Airport opened. Was such a big deal. It was heralded as the nicest airport in the world. The president at the time, Dwight Eisenhower, was in full support of O'Hare being built. John F. Kennedy came later on in the 60s and had this entire ceremony supporting the O'Hare International Airport. So just a few years later, in 1971, there is a very divisive issue about housing in the city of Chicago. And Mayor Daley, at the time, the original Mayor Daley, was very open to the idea of federal funds to build that wonderful international airport. And then in 1971, he turned down federal funds to build housing for minorities in Chicago. Well, grassroots folks around the city of Chicago were furious, and they hired Saul Alinsky as a community organizer to support the idea of Mayor Daley accepting those federal funds for minority housing in Chicago. And Saul Alinsky created the first ever shit-in. Yes, not a sit-in, a shit-in at O'Hare International. He recruited 2,500 activists. And the idea was for one day in this international hub where folks from around the world are traveling, that every single stall and every single bathroom in the airport was filled. And by people who were bringing books and things to read to spend an entire day sitting in the stall, and lines at every single urinal and men's bathrooms, with each person trained to stand there for 5 to 10 minutes and then leave, creating congestion and chaos throughout the entire airport. And what happened once all of these 2,500 people were recruited? Well, Mayor Daley changed his mind. And within 48 hours of the mayor's administration finding out about this potential shit-in, they decided to meet and compromise. Again, rule number 9, the threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. The threat of the O'Hare shit-in, which would have been horrible for the city of Chicago, it still was not as terrifying as the thing itself. Carlos, have you ever flown through O'Hare International Airport?
I have. I've flown through many of the big international airports, and at that particular time, the story you're telling, O'Hare was the prime jewel, the most up-to-date airport in the world. The jewel of airports, and Mayor Daley was under his city, and to hear this type of thing is just and I have to refer back to rule number 1. Power is not only what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have. So just hearing about that he's going to bring in 2,500 or 3,000 people, and you can only imagine City Hall in Chicago, right? So before this thing got put in action, it might have not been able to be put in action, but simply the perception that Alinsky was on the ground and that, quote unquote, they had recruited 2,500 people for this particular event, that it was going to stink up the place. It made him, put a pause and say, okay, let's talk.
Absolutely. So never travel O'Hare International Airport if Saul Alinsky's in town. But again, rule number 9, the threat's usually more terrifying than the thing itself. Going forward, rule number 10, the major premise for tactics is the development of operations that will maintain a constant pressure on the opposition. Again, going back to rule number 8, keep the pressure on. This is basically the how to keep that pressure on. It's about building organization. And this goes back to our episode on top 10 grassroots tips. One of the key components, Carlos, to your organization on the ground is making sure that you have an organized operation. An organization, I believe, is one of the 3 key pillars of your grassroots activism plan. So major premise of tactics is the development of operations. We talked about this a little bit in that episode. It's the 5-10-20 rule. Just a quick example. Like if there's a state legislator that I want to impact, I'm going to find, rather than one person, Caleb, going to that state rep 35 different times and annoying the hell out of them. Instead, I pick 5 people who are close to that state rep who agree with me, who are willing to influence or tell that state rep, hey, you should consider this bill to support. 10 key influencers in their constituency that will put pressure on that state rep as well, who agree with us. And I'm sorry, 10 key influencers and 20 constituents of that state rep. So you're hitting them with 5 close friends, 10 key influencers, 20 different constituents. So rather than me going to the state rep 35 individual times, now this particular state rep is being hit from 35 different angles. And again, that creates legitimacy for your issue, and it puts the pressure on the state rep for them to support your initiative. Carlos, what's an example? I know you used to take people to Tallahassee all the time and go to the state capitol to try to influence their elected officials. How exactly did you develop that sort of set of operations to get them to the capitol to influence folks?
Well, it definitely starts with getting to know your community, knowing what the issues that are important, and finding those individuals outside your community that consider that an important issue, and that they want to make a change. So sometimes you got to go outside your community. You got to ask. You got to sometimes build coalitions. It's very important too that the more names and number and organizations you can have on a letter, or to show up representing organizations, that's a huge multiplication of that 5, 10, 20, and also just letting people know and bringing them in, having those conversations, and also letting them know that you have the ability to take them to Tallahassee or take them to City Hall. These things have to get going months in advance and prepare You also want to prepare your individuals, these volunteers / activists, in case they're going to talk in front of a committee, in front of a panel. You just don't want anybody showing up and being ready for asking to be asked questions. But it definitely is a combination of numerous things, and the organization is crucial. I've seen individuals just put things overnight, and it just doesn't come across. So give yourself time, be serious. And if you can't really do it, well, I understand, but make an effort to really put your stuff together early on.
And it's so much fun for a group of folks to say, hey, we're going to the state capitol, we're going to meet elected officials, where we might actually testify on a committee, whatever it is. It's fun and exciting. And that goes back to rule number 6 of just making sure that you're utilizing tactics that your folks will enjoy. Because if they're enjoying it and having fun, they keep coming back. Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, episode number 2. We're going up to rule number 13. Rule 11 is next. You are listening to the Grassroots Chronicles at the Artsign Network. Rule number 11, Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. If you push a negative hard enough, it'll break through to its counter side. This is based on the principle that every positive has a negative. So again, every positive, meaning our opposition's positive narratives that they're pitching, there's still a negative narrative that we might be able to push so much that it becomes a positive for us, meaning it might cancel out our opponent's narrative or even shift the narrative to become a negative narrative. Great example, 2004, John Kerry's running against the incumbent George W. Bush for president of the United States. This is really when the word progressive found its way into the vernacular Rolodex of leftists today. Because before progressive, the word we heard a lot was liberal. However, in 2004, Karl Rove had a great idea. In running George W. Bush's re-election campaign, he said, let's take the narrative around liberal and let's throw it in the negative trash can. Let's talk about how the word liberal is loony liberal, limousine liberal, tax and spend liberal, left-wing socialist liberal. And something that John Kerry was really proud about, being liberal, as he would self-describe it, was then turned as a negative. And such a negative when John Kerry, about 2 months before the election in 2004, came out in a speech and he said, quote, I'm liberal and I'm damn proud of it, end quote. Well, by then, Karl Rove had already created the narrative that the word liberal is actually bad. And John Kerry went down in almost every single poll, somewhere between 3% and 6%, simply because he utilized the word liberal. If you push a negative hard enough, meaning the negative connotations of that word liberal, it'll break through into its counter side, meaning it'll be a positive for George W. Bush's campaign. This is based on the principle that every positive has a negative. So any narrative that your opposition is pitching, you can find a way to counter that narrative with a negative narrative and then canceling out what your opponent actually has to say that they think is good. Carlos, do you have an example narrative about a time when a positive narrative was switched into a negative one by the opposition?
I cannot think of one off the top of my head, but I know there's numerous. But I can tell you that it is important that in your narrative you have a solution. Because if you don't have a solution, you're going to get caught. And that's what Saul Alinsky was good at. He would always say, yeah, so what's your solution? And then he could defend his narrative, because if he didn't have a constructive solution to
And talking about, opening, you opened the conversation, Caleb, as, kind of our modern day example being Donald Trump. And in this instance, I would say the use of deplorables by Hillary Clinton, which again, initially, right out of the gate, it has a negative connotation to it. But what did conservatives and Trump, supporters do is that they turned it into a positive for them. they said, yeah, like if that's what you're going to label us, then they wore it as a badge of honor, and it completely took the sting out of it.
I am stealing that example forever. That was an excellent example of pushing the negative hard enough where it becomes a pot. That was excellent. Thank you, Jonathan.
That's my job.
Carlos, you brought up a great point about how every narrative should provide some type of positive alternative. That's rule number 12. The price of a successful attack is a constructive alternative. And we talked about human action model, Ludwig von Mises, a few episodes ago. And in human action model, you start with a sense of unease, vision of a better state, path to get there. This is really that vision of a better state, providing a constructive and realistic alternative. So many people are good at raising hell. So many people are good at going to county council, and for 2 minutes, they're allotted time just raising as much hell as possible. However, if you're not providing that constructive alternative, then you might not be doing much good for your cause. You might not be able to persuade people to another option because you haven't provided another option.
I think at that point, because I have a friend who falls into that category, religiously goes to city council meetings and, really kind of gets worked up, and he's angry at them over, some issues that he's trying to bring to light. But, he doesn't provide that alternative option or solution for them. And so after a while, you just become the noise in the room. And they now know him every time they see him come up. And so I think, by now they just subconsciously, I think, just block him out.
Great example. My mother-in-law is a city clerk in Grand Junction, Colorado. And she has to run every single city council meeting, and I think it's every other Tuesday. And they have the same 3 people who show up, stand up at the lectern when it's time, they yell for 3 minutes, and they walk away. And no one in city council takes these 3 folks seriously. Because even though they are passionate, even though they show up at every meeting and they keep the pressure on, right? Rule number 8, they don't provide that constructive alternative. Therefore, they're not taken seriously. So provide the constructive alternative. And through human action model, going to the next step, provide the path to get there as well. Rule number 13, Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals. Pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. It's much easier to attack and bring down an individual than it is an institution. It's that old saying, you can't fight City Hall. However, you might be able to fight the mayor individually. Picking out an individual, it humanizes an issue. Folks say, oh, we can't change Washington. It's impossible to drain the swamp. However, if your congressman is part of the swamp, then your way of draining it is, again, personalizing, picking the target, freezing it, then personalizing it. It's so much easier for individuals to vote against or have negative feelings against an individual and a villain because it's part of a story. And issues can be overwhelming and frankly boring. People don't want to learn about percentages, numbers, and facts. They want to learn about how someone is an evil villain and they can vote against them. Paul Tudor Jones, he's a guy who supports charter schools. He lives in Connecticut, right outside of New York City. He's a hedge fund manager, and he has made many gifts to different charter schools in the New York City area. And many public school union members in New York heard about this. They had been fighting the idea of charter schools and public schools private schools for many, many years. But rather than fight the institution of charter schools, they said, let's take this one guy who's basically funding a couple of these schools. We're going to pick him as the target. We're going to freeze it. We're going to personalize it, meaning we're going to go to his front yard in Connecticut and picket him. We are going to protest him personally, and we are going to wind up forcing him to no longer make donations to fund charter schools.
I feel icky about this rule. I think it's very smart to maybe humanize a certain issue and pick an individual who you can attack. Shouldn't even say attack, that you can disagree with. But the idea of standing in someone's front yard where their kids and their family members can see it, many voters are going to be turned off by this tactic. So that's why I have, mixed feelings about rule number 13. Carlos,
Well,
how do
we've
you...
seen this example recently with some of the Supreme Court decisions.
Exactly.
And seeing, especially progressives, liberals out there protesting and doxing, our Supreme Court justices.
Doxing is a great word. Or I think there's a huge difference. Maybe that's my internal struggle here, is I look at this rule and I think it's doxing. But, doxing may fall into this rule, but I think there's more appropriate ways to sort of humanize opposition and then target them rather than showing up in their front yard with a cardboard sign.
I think back in Saul Alinsky's times, that was not a bad thing to do. I can understand it. But with today's communications and the way everybody is acting and reacting and hypersensitive, you lose control. And that's where I have a problem. This is the type of rule where fast, in a short time, people will take over, and it can end up pretty bad. And that's where this rule, maybe back in Saul Alinsky's times, was workable, was manageable. You could manage people within this. But I think in today's world now, with the social media platforms, the telephones, your mobile phones, you can organize people in a heartbeat, and you can start marching down. And there's no organization. It's just people with emotional, feelings that they think what they're feeling is the right thing or the wrong thing, and it could get ugly pretty fast.
It can. And a good example of when this rule actually doesn't work comes in the state of Wisconsin, shortly after 2010. So Scott Walker, elected governor of Wisconsin, Republican, very conservative, trying to change a lot of things in terms of collective bargaining in the state of Wisconsin with state employees. Creates a huge amount of tension. The opposition picked him as a target. They froze him. They personalized it. They were the ones who protested in his front yard, and the protests stemmed a recall election. And what happened? He not only won the recall election, but then he won re-election in 2014 after that. So you have an example of too much polarizing and too much personalizing in terms of Scott Walker. Like you said, Carlos, in current times, it feels like it crosses a line a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's in today's world, it's a lot more difficult to manage individuals because it's just, we've seen it over and over in numerous situations on TV where you can see these people just absolutely losing control and putting other people's lives in danger.
And look, in terms of humanizing things, that's what we believe. We believe in building narrative, sharing stories, demonstrate how issues are about people and this one particular person rather than just this large number. Humanizing in terms of grassroots activism is incredibly effective. But this rule number 13 steps beyond just humanizing. It's really beyond ridicule. It's harassment. And I think that's why I don't agree with it. You see a lot of these tactics used today that are successful. This is one that I don't think is too great. Well, with that, Mr. Torres, I know you have read Saul Alinsky, a good book or a good bit. Is there a particular rule that is your favorite?
I think maybe because of, we mentioned it today, so maybe it's just top of mind. But honestly, I think the unpredictability of being able to take a negative and flipping it into a positive, there's something just so masterful about that, that when you're able to do that properly, it just has such a greater impact because not only do you remove the power of that label, but it also diminishes, I think, the power of the one who was trying to use it as an insult or use it as a tactic against the other side. And so, I mean, when it's done properly, I think it's just, I mean, there's just so many levels to the impact that it has that I think it just reinforced what a lot of people maybe subliminally or even top of mind already felt about Hillary Clinton and how kind of vindictive she was and you know how kind of angry and bitter she was. You know, it just kind of supplemented that perception of her, and which made it all that much easier for Trump supporters to adopt it and wear it as a badge of honor.
Absolutely. Great points. Great points. All right. So that wraps up Saul Alinsky, 2 episodes. Again, we're not condoning or endorsing Saul Alinsky's political beliefs. We don't do that on this show. Instead, we just wanted to open up his different rules and tactics that are utilized by left, right, libertarian, populist, and all of the above today. As always, you've been listening to the Grassroots Chronicles at the Yard Sign Network. We are really excited to watch you change your city, your county, your state, and our country. On behalf of Mr. Producer Jonathan Torres, Mr. Grassroots Carlos Mulathaler, I am Mr. Communication Caleb Stokes, signing off from the Grassroots Chronicles at the Yard Sign Network.